Well, shalom, and thank you so much for having me here. It's the first time that I'm speaking in this northern part of Israel. Certainly not the last. It's a beautiful part of the country, so I hope to have many opportunities to come here. So I've been teaching at Harvard for 36 years now, a long time. And when I began teaching at Harvard as a young assistant professor, I was asked to teach the course that none of my colleagues wanted to teach, physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. No, most of them already hated physics before coming into my classroom. And most of my colleagues didn't want to teach that course because they would get poor evaluations. Pre-meds are not very kind to physicists. So that's why they thought, let Arik Mazur teach that course. I didn't know any of this, so I happily accepted that assignment. Besides, I didn't really have any choice. Now, thinking back of when I started teaching, you know, it's kind of strange, but when I started teaching, I never asked myself the question, how am I going to teach? That question did not even come up in my mind. Which is strange, because when you do something new in your life, that should really be the first question that you ask yourself. But for some reason, it was completely clear to me what I was going to do. I was going to lecture. The same way that, you know, oh, how come that oh, I see. I have to prevent my computer from going to sleep. So let me get this back on. Sorry about that. And let me prevent this from happening again behind my back. Prevent it from going to sleep there. Good. So, you know, I decided to do what my professors had done to me. Lecture. After all, how had I learned physics? By sitting in a classroom, not very different from this classroom, and listen to my professors lecture to me. And I'm quite sure that when they started teaching, they made exactly the same assumption. You know, they had been taught by professors in a classroom, not very different from this, by lecturing. And so on, generation after generation after generation, all the way back to this guy here, which is actually a German professor who was teaching at the University of Bologna in 1125, a guest lecturer, actually turned out to be a royalty. Now, look at that scene and compare it to me talking to you actually right now. We don't wear those clothes anymore when we teach. We still wear them at graduation, at least in the US. I don't know if you have the same tradition of wearing gowns at graduation, but in the US we still wear these. And in Europe, where I was educated, that was the case too, to remind ourselves that we're steeped in medieval traditions. You know, and down to some, you know, uncanny little details, like this person sleeping. That scene is not very different from me starting to teach my course many years ago at Harvard. This is actually a picture of me teaching back in the 80s. It's a very old picture. It was taken BC. Before computers. No, I'm not that old, you know. I'm using an overhead projector, as you can see. And something interesting happened. The feedback that I received was very positive. I already told you that most of my colleagues didn't get good evaluations. In fact, at the end of the semester, most of them would come close to jumping out of the window, you know, when they saw the poor ratings they got from these pre-medical students, but not so for me. I got a 4.5, 4.8 on a 5-point scale. Obviously, I was doing the right thing. Also, I could give my students some pretty difficult exam problems. Problems I wasn't sure I would do well on an exam, but by and large, they did well. So, one, they liked me as an instructor. Two, They did well on what I thought were difficult problems. Obviously, I was doing the right thing. In fact, very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. Now, that turned out to be a complete illusion, a very pleasant illusion, but a complete illusion. As I will point out to you, it was very far from the truth. Even though there were always some negative signs, but I'm a positive thinker, so I tend to ignore the negative signs. You know, there would be some students who, in spite of giving me high evaluation, would write in the comment section, "Physics is boring." I was thinking, why are they giving me a high evaluation, but then they write down, "Physics is boring"? I couldn't make any sense of that, so I ignored it. And I continued to focus on the positive signs. And for probably close to 7 years, I taught this way, thinking I did a really good job. And in a sense, by the traditional metrics that we use, I was doing a good job. But after about 7 years, I read in the literature, in the education literature, an article that claimed that students who are not physics majors, engineering and pre-medical students, learn next to nothing in their introductory physics courses. There was a professor who wrote this article at Arizona State University. He developed a test called the Force Concept Inventory. Now, this talk is not about physics, but you know, since I'm a physicist, I want to give you the context. This is about the only physics I will discuss with you today. The Force Concept Inventory focuses on one idea, the idea of force, and tests students' understanding of that very basic concept in physics by asking just word-based questions. No equations, no numbers, no drawings, just words. Now, all students in introductory physics can recite Newton's third law. You may have heard about it. Action is reaction. Or the force of object 1 on object 2 is the same magnitude as the force exerted by object 2 on object 1 whenever the two interact. All students can recite that. In equation form, F12 is equal to F21. But apparently, according to this article that Hestenes wrote, if you replace 1 by heavy truck and 2 by light car, the students forget all about Newton's third law and they're convinced that the heavier object exerts a larger force on the lighter car than the other way around. I read this article and I thought, no way. I learned this in high school. I mean, you know, this may be true for students in Arizona, but at Harvard, no way, you know. In fact, I've been so convinced that my students knew this already before coming to my class that I didn't spend much time discussing force in my course. We right away went to more difficult concepts. But you know, I'm a scientist, so I've learned one thing, namely not to rely on anecdotal evidence. So I thought, I am going to show that in my class, the students can answer these questions. It was already close to the end of the semester, so it was too late to do a pre-test, but at least I wanted to show that my students would get full score. It took no more than a few minutes for my illusion to be shattered. Hardly had they started looking at this quiz, as I called it, or one student raised her hand. I walked up to her, and she looked at me, and she said, "Professor Mazor, how should we answer these questions? According to what you taught us, or according to the way we usually think about these things?" I will never forget that moment, because I was looking at her totally dumbstruck. I had no idea how to answer that question. And by the time the test had been completed, it became very clear that there was a major problem in my class, and that, you know, yes, I might have been a good teacher by the traditional standards, but my students hadn't even learned about Newton's laws, which was, you know, all the way at the beginning of the curriculum. So they might have been able to pass the test, that I had not learned any physics. So that made me actually rethink my approach and rethink of what I was actually doing in the classroom. And I would like to briefly talk about this picture here and ask you, what is it that is actually happening in a typical lecture? And I know, ironically, I'm giving you a lecture now about not lecturing, but I'm not trying to teach you physics, so I guess that's all right. So what is it, if you look at this picture, I would like you to describe to me, in one or two words, the situation that is illustrated on the screen behind me. And ideally, I would like to hear a verb. But there are two verbs I do not want to hear: teaching or learning. So you have to find other words and verbs. So just blurt it out, whatever comes to mind.
Receivers and, I don't know.
Receivers?
Receivers.
Receivers, listeners.
And transmitters.
I heard somebody say passive. Yes.
One-sided delivery of information.
You must have heard my talk before, because that's exactly what I was after. And usually it takes a long while for any audience to come up. So I have to give you credit for that. Yes, it's some people say communication. But communication is a two-way process. And I know that, it's typically not easy to communicate. Yes, it might be a few people in the front row who ask questions and answer questions, but most of them sit silently, isolated. So what I was hoping to hear and heard was lectures focus on the delivery of information. And thinking back, the students had actually tried to tell me that, and I had ignored it. You see, when I started teaching, I already told you that, I did not ask myself, how am I going to teach? But there were some questions that came up in my mind. Not how am I going to teach, but what exactly? So I went to a colleague who had taught the course before, and I asked him that question, and he said, oh, in this course in the past, we have used the book by Halliday and Resnick. And he told me, which came somewhat as a surprise to me, having been educated in Europe, he told me that the students would buy the book. I don't know about you, and I don't know about Israel, but in Europe, in Leiden, where I got educated, we wouldn't buy the textbook. I mean, why buy the textbook if the professor is presenting the content of the textbook to you? Anyway, so he told me that I had to go to the bookstore, the Harvard bookstore, we call it the Harvard Coop, and make sure that they had enough textbooks in stock for the beginning of the semester. So 2 months before the semester started, I went to the Harvard Coop and talked to the person in charge of buying textbook, and I said, be sure that by September 15th, you have 150, because at that time I had 150 students, 150 copies of Halliday and Resnick in stock. And as I was walking back to my office, I thought, wait a minute, if the students have the book, and I have the same book, then what do I do in the classroom? I started getting nervous, so I knocked on my colleague's door, and I asked him that question. He said, oh, Eric, don't worry. There are lots of physics textbooks. And he showed me a whole collection that he had collected over the course of his career. And I started looking, and very quickly, I found the perfect book. It was perfect for two reasons. One, it was different from Halliday and Resnick, so I was at least not simply regurgitating the content of the book that the students had bought. But that was not the important reason. The important reason was the book was out of print. You couldn't get a copy of it anymore. So for every class, I would spend 10 hours preparing lecture notes, and then in class I would project the lecture notes on the screen, or I would write them on the board behind me. And because my notes were a little bit different from the textbook, I thought it would be good for the students to have a copy of my lecture notes. Now remember, this was BC before computers, so it was definitely before the internet, and there was no way of digitally handing them out. So my classroom was very similar to this one, with 2 exits at the top. So towards the end of the class, I made sure that my teaching assistants put 2 piles of photocopied lecture notes near the door. So as the students walked out, you know, they could take a picture, they could take a copy of the lecture notes. Now, why do you think that I hand them out at the end of class and not the beginning of class?
So that they will stay.
So they would stay and they would pay attention, but isn't that already admitting that there's a problem? I mean, why force the students to get the information out of my mouth if they could get them from looking at my notes? That never occurred to me. However, what happened came as quite a shock to me. Because that first year, at the end of the semester, in spite of giving me high evaluations for my teaching, about half a dozen students wrote in the comment section at the bottom, "Professor Mazur is lecturing straight from his lecture notes." Hello? I mean, what was I supposed to do? Develop another set of lecture notes to lecture from that was different from the lecture notes I gave out to them? These ungrateful students. I was livid. I was really mad. But you know, the students had a point. I was lecturing from my lecture notes. And if the students had read the book, they would have seen that the book was something different from my lecture notes. Now, this process that I'm describing here is taking place all around the world, in classrooms. Right now, I wouldn't even be surprised if there are some classes on this campus that are currently following exactly that model. In fact, look at the space here, right? I mean, it's designed for the delivery of information. So, given the fact that most academic institutions around the world use this model, it may not be such a crazy question to ask, is that what education is? Is education simply the transfer of information? I mean, given all the energy you put into that, you may well be led to believe that. Let's do a poll. And here's how we're going to do the poll. I'm going to ask you a question. It's a multiple choice question I'm going to ask you. Well, it's going to be a yes-no question, so just 2 choices. And I want you to think about it, and then I'm going to count to 3, 1, 2, 3, and I want you to put your hand on your chest indicating your choice. So if you think it's choice 1, you put 1 finger. If you think it's choice 2, 2 fingers. 3, 4. I won't go beyond 5. This first question will just be 2. You all have to do that at the same time. If you do not put your hand on your chest when I count to 3, 1, 2, 3, I will come to you with this microphone and put it right in your face, and you're going to have to tell the whole room what your choice is. By the way, I do the same thing to my students, and when I tell them that, quickly they put their hand on their chest to vote. Okay, instructions clear? Good, okay. So, here's the question. Is education just the transfer of information? 1, yes. 2, no, education is more than just the transfer of information. At the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. 3? There's no 3. Oh, okay, that doesn't seem. Okay, so I think, you know, from what I can see, I saw maybe 1 or 2 ones, and just about, you know, the overwhelming majority had a 2. Let me first address the ones here. You are about to lose your job. Because let's imagine for a moment that education is just the transfer of information. I know we mostly disagree with that statement, but let's assume that that would be true. What would be the logical thing to do in the 21st century if education was just a transfer of information? What would be the pragmatic thing to do? Put it on the internet, right? Film every instructor in Hebrew, in English, in Spanish, in Chinese, in physics, chemistry, whatever. Film it and put it online. In fact, it is already happening. What would we lose? What would we lose if we took every single course, filmed it in different languages, and put it online? Of course, we'd lose our jobs, but, you know, in addition, interaction. But how much interaction is there really in a classroom built like this? I make a habit, and I highly recommend you do that too. I make a habit of occasionally visiting a random class on my own campus or another class. I sit in the back. I don't even tell the instructor I'm coming. I try to be not seen. I sit in the back and I observe. Very interesting experience because you get a very different perspective. As a teacher, you're used to this perspective from the front of the classroom. Now you see from the back, and you see that a lot of students have their laptops open and they're on Facebook or, you know, on the news or whatever. They're not at all doing what you expect them to do. You might be thinking they're taking notes, but in reality, they're just posting something on some social media. But it's also interesting to look at quote-unquote the interaction, and in fact, there's very little interaction. We have some pretty spectacular lecturers on campus, you know, Steven Pinker, you know, it's fantastic lectures that they deliver on different subjects. And, you know, it's the same thing you always see. You see, you know, a dynamic person talking, pacing, and then talking for a few minutes and then stopping and saying, does anybody have a question? No. Anybody? No, you don't even hear no. Anybody? And, you know, the students look down, they don't want to make eye contact, you know, and if the instructor waits long enough, it's always the same person in the front row who reluctantly asks a question. Most of the students do not want to interact. And in part, it's a result of this architecture. Who's responsible for this architecture here? That we see here or in any other similar classroom? The architect, but the architect bases his or her designs on somebody else. The ancient Greek, exactly. They were the first one to develop the theater. Well, for what purpose did they develop the theater? For, as the name says, theater, for performances. That's right. In such a way so that everybody could hear and everybody could see the performers. Now, did the ancient Greek use the theater as a learning space? The answer is no. You came in with the expectation, I am going to listen to Arik Mazur talk, not with, I'm going to, you know, interact with him. In fact, if you go to a cinema or a theater or whatever, or a concert, it'd be bad if you started to interact. Though people don't want you to interact, you have to be silent and listen and watch. So, in a sense, we bring the mindset of a movie theater or a concert or a play to the auditorium that is built for teaching. So I think people are automatically put into a passive mindset when they step into a classroom like this. The other thing is, perhaps also very important to realize, is that in a sense, when you're sitting in a classroom like this, or in any space, where there's a person presenting, like me right now, your brain is, in some sense, being held captive by the presenter. Let's say that I was not talking about teaching, but I'm talking about physics, and I'm saying something that confuses you. And you think, how does that work? Your mind drifts, your mind wanders, and as your mind wanders, you can no longer listen to the person in front of the classroom who continues to talk. Right? Because the person in front of the classroom is not aware that your mind is not with him or her anymore. Consequently, you realize you're no longer listening, so you tell yourself, well, let's stop thinking and continue to listen, because it's either one or the other. So in a sense, the standard classroom does not permit much time and space for a meaningful cognitive engagement with the material. Have you ever had a student in your classroom raise his or her hand and say, Professor, Could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think. It's never happened. But you have to admit, that would be the right thing to do. With online material, you can pause and think. Not that students do that, but you can. So this is all to say that if education was just a transfer of information, then we're doomed. And institutions like yours and mine will have to stop to exist because there are better ways of transferring information. Luckily, I think that will not happen, and I'm happy to see that most of you agree with me, because education is so much more than a transfer of information. So now I'd like to turn to the 95% of you who said no. What more than just the transfer of information is education?
Guiding.
Guiding.
Discussion. Makes them understand.
Discussion, understanding, whatever that means.
Developing skills.
Developing skills.
Coaching.
Coaching.
Thinking.
Thinking.
Raising interest. Raising interest.
Raising interest. I would argue that raising interest, you could possibly do that by video recording. Right? In fact, I've seen some TED Talks that are a whole lot more inspirational than most of the lectures I've taken when I was at my university. Yes?
I believe that the role of the student is to criticize what you try to teach them and to doubt what you try to teach them.
To question and to doubt, exactly. I think I would probably summarize that in the following sense. So first of all, you know, to me, that test was a discovery that I wasn't a good teacher at all. You know, it was just an illusion that was reinforced by external signals that I just misinterpreted. And I think that we all misinterpret. But sort of to summarize what we've sort of discussed here, is that, you know, I started to see education as a two-step process. Yes, you have to have transfer information. If you have no transfer information at all, then there's nothing to base yourself on. If, for example, as you very correctly point out, there has to be questioning and criticizing, there has to be questioning and criticizing of something, right? So there has to be some information transfer. But that's not enough. There has to be some way of assimilating through questioning, through thinking, through a lot of the things that you were saying, this information. I think Piaget would have called it to accommodate the information. You have to connect the new information to things that are already in your brain. You have to sort of build the mental framework with which you know, become a better thinker. And that test, in a sense, made me discover that that second step was not happening in my classroom. I was essentially getting stuck on one. In the traditional approach to teaching, the emphasis in class is on step one. Where did step two happen for us, for you, for you, for you, for me? I've often asked myself the question, where did my brain go? Oh, now I get it. When you were a student, where did you have the aha moments?
At home.
At home, exactly. So in a sense, in the traditional approach to teaching, the emphasis in class is on the information transfer, and the assimilation is expected to happen out of class. Now, it happened for us. Otherwise, we would never become professors. It happened for you. It happened for me. And it's very easy for us to believe that because it happened for us, it will happen for our students. But you know, we became professors. We're sort of a peculiar kind of people. Not only we became professors, we became professionals in our discipline, which means we have a much higher intrinsic motivation in our own discipline than most of our students. Most of my students in my class were engineers and pre-meds. They couldn't care less about physics. So to expect that that second step will happen to them outside of class is a big assumption. And clearly, it was not happening for my students at Harvard. So if you ask yourself, of these two steps, which is the easy one? I think we would all agree, step one is the easy one, step two is the hard one. So it's kind of ironic that we spend most of our time in the classroom on the easy part and leave the hard part to the students. So after this sort of disheartening discovery, I decided what I should do is focus on that second step, not on the first step. And that gave me the idea of inverting the sequence. Let's do the information transfer out of the classroom so that we can spend our time in the classroom improving understanding of the material. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about step one, but to me step one is the easy part of education, so I don't want to talk about step one. It's not completely trivial. It's not obvious how you make your students responsible, especially if they don't expect it, for the transfer of information, but there are currently lots of ways of doing that, and we could discuss it briefly later. I want to answer this question. If you have successfully gotten your students to prepare themselves for step two in the classroom, then what do you do in the classroom? Well, the answer to that question is actually nothing new. Teach by questioning rather than by telling. Who said that first, by the way? Socrates, exactly. 2,000 years ago said we should teach by questioning. Confucius, back in China, said more or less the same thing. And here we're in the 21st century, and we're still mostly teaching by telling. Now, I wasn't thinking, how should I do this? Oh, Socrates. No, not at all. It was a completely accidental rediscovery, if you want. See, I told you about this test, right, that I gave to my student, the forced concept inventory. Not only was I shocked how poorly my students had done, they were shocked too. And they were worried, even though it was not for credit in the course, they were worried because the final exam was only 2 weeks away, and they couldn't understand why they had obtained such low scores. To them, in their mind, it made completely sense that the truck exerted a larger force on the small car than the other way around. So they asked me to go through every question on that test. Well, I couldn't do this in the regular classes, so I booked a big classroom. There were 250 students at that time. And from 7 p.m. at night to 10 p.m., I went through every single question on this test. And I remember coming to this question of the heavy truck and the light car. And I thought, it's easy, Newton's third law, action is reaction. Nothing to understand, so I turned my back to them. I made a drawing of the car on one side of the board, the truck on the other. I drew the force of gravity on the truck, the force of gravity on the car, the force up from the road on the truck, the force up from the road on the car, and then the force of the truck on the car, and the car on the truck. And I turned around and I said, by Newton's third law, these two forces are the same. What more is there to explain about it? I turned around and I looked at them, and I could at once see that they were confused. So I said, is there a question? They were so confused they could not articulate any coherent questions. So I thought, this is serious, you know. I mean, this is one of the most basic things in physics. And so I thought, maybe they're confused by the fact that the forces are the same, but the effects are different. The car is more affected by the force than the truck, but that's because the car is lighter and the truck is heavier. So I should bring in Newton's second law. Newton's second law. I said second law before I meant third law. I'm tired. So F equals ma, right? So I erased the board. I started all over, and in the next 8 minutes, I managed to make the most brilliant explanation you can possibly imagine, okay? After 8 minutes, the whole board was covered with equations and drawings. F equals ma, I'd shown that the accelerations could be different in spite of the forces being the same, and the two being locked together. It was just brilliant, okay? I was so proud of it, right? Of course, I'd done this all with my back to them, and I turned around, you know, covered in chalk dust. They looked even more confused. And they could still not tell me what it was that confused them. So in a way that I understood. I mean, there were some students attempting to indicate what confused them, but I could not follow it. So I didn't know what to do. So in a moment of despair, I said, why don't you just discuss it with each other? And something happened that I had never seen in my entire career. Complete, utter chaos, okay? All 250 students, they started talking. They forgot about me in front of it. I could have walked away. They would not have noticed it, okay? They were so engaged in this discussion. But what was even more surprising was that in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I was totally flabbergasted. I had tried in 2 different ways, 10 minutes total, to explain it to them, the expert, me, unsuccessfully. But in 2 minutes, they just figured it out. I thought, how can this be? But think about it for a moment. Let's say you have 2 students sitting next to each other. John and Mary. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around. But that's not the important point. The important point is this. Mary is more likely to convince John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that the beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur learned it such a long time ago, in his mind it's so clear that he cannot even understand why somebody doesn't get it. It's what it's sort of a strange argument, right? And it's what my colleague Steven Pinker, the famous psychologist, calls the curse of knowledge. As you get to know something better and better over time, it doesn't become easier to teach. It becomes harder because you forget your own difficulties, you forget your own struggles. You can no longer connect to the struggles that your student had. But Mary, having recently learned it, still understands what John's problems are. I went, wow. And I thought, maybe that's what I should do in the classroom. So the next year, I stopped lecturing. I told my students to read the book before coming to class. And then in class, I would talk a few minutes, not like now, just talk a few minutes. And then I put a question on the screen. And after putting the question on the screen, I give students time to think. It's silent. I tell them, do not talk to your neighbor. It's almost like an exam, except that there is no credit. So they think about it. After they think about it, I make them commit to an answer. So initially, we didn't have any technology, so we did hands on the chest, as we did just a moment ago. And then later came the clicker, and now you can use smartphones, and you don't even have to use multiple choice questions anymore. But you know, the technology is not important. It's the approach and the philosophy that is important. So I make them commit. I tell them, you know, if you don't know what the answer is, make it a game, but you have to put your hand on your chest and choose an answer. And after they choose an answer, I tell them, now find a neighbor who has a different answer. So they have to find a neighbor who has a different answer, and then try to convince that neighbor that you are right and he or she is wrong. Total chaos, which goes on for a few minutes. And during those minutes, actually, you'll see students go, oh, it's amazing. You can actually see the light bulb turn on right in front of you. Also, as an instructor, I typically walk around and I listen. And I'll go, oh, wow, that's what they are thinking. It's like, you know, becoming aware of the way your students think about the material, one that you're no longer aware of when you're just standing in front of the classroom. Then I have them vote again. And I forgot to tell you one thing. I tried to arrange it in such a way that for this first poll, between 30% and 70% get the right or desired answer. If it's more than 70%, you know, there's not much useful discussion that's going to take place. If it's less than 30%, there's simply not enough students to teach the remaining students what you want them to learn. So if it's between 30 and 70% this first time around, it's not unusual to go to 80, 90, or even very close to 100% after the discussion. So it's actually a lot of learning and aha taking place. I wrap up with an explanation, which can either be me explaining it to them, or I can ask some students to explain it to the rest of the classroom. And then the cycle repeats until the class time is up. So I basically go as many times through that cycle with different questions as possible. And of course, the learning is taking place during this discussion. Let me show you a little video clip. I did not connect the sound on my computer, so I'll just move up the sound here. It's not that important. Let me put this as high as I can. Let me show you how that works in practice. Oh, it's very... That's weird, it's very low. So actually, I don't know why the sound is so low. Let me see if I can turn it up another way. But here it's quiet anyway. I can see, if we use technology, what the answers are.
We have a disagreement clearly here.
I do not show this distribution.
You can convince one another of the correct choice.
Right, it goes out of
You see the aha moment?
Initially we had sort of an even split, and now we have an absolutely overwhelming majority for choice number 2.
The bottom of this loop is...
You know, and that's not unusual to go from 50-50 to most of them having the right answer. So what's going on here? One is it's active, not passive. It is impossible to sleep through my classes because every few minutes your neighbor will start talking to you. Secondly, it's a two-way flow of information. There's not only information going from me to them, but information from them going back to me. I can see it then and there if they get it or don't get it. I don't have to wait till the exam to find out, oh, they didn't understand this. I better spend more time. Thirdly, and I think this has been shown to be so important in education, it is continuous feedback on the learning to the students. Let's say that you're a student who has answered that question, you know, and you had A initially, and then you talked about it, and you still had A, which is the wrong answer because it was B, was the right answer there. And then you see, by the way, I forgot to tell you that I do not show the distribution before the discussion. I only show the distribution after the discussion, so they don't know going into the discussion what's right or wrong or how the class is answered as a whole. But after that, I show the distribution, and I say B is the right answer, and they see 85% at B, and I'm in the 50% who did not have B. It's sort of like continuous feedback, and you know, it tells me I better look at this, you know, next time before I go to the next class. It's sort of non-threatening feedback on the learning. And lastly, it personalizes the learning. Student A can help student B. Student C can help student D, even though B and D have two very different problems. I cannot do that as a single instructor. I may be able to explain things maybe one way, maybe two ways, but certainly not 10 different ways. There's just no time to do that. It sort of parallel tasks the teaching. Do you want to try this? I'd hope to have a little bit more enthusiasm here. Let's try this again. Do you want to try it? Sure. Oh, good, good. So I hope that you all read those. I sent Osnat 2 paragraphs on thermal expansion. Did you all read those? No? Did we forget? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding you. But look, in order to really model it, you would have had to prepare yourself. So that means that I will need to lecture you briefly about thermal expansion. Actually, I'm very grateful because I love lecturing and I miss it. I don't get to do it in my own classes. So thank you for the opportunity to lecture you briefly about thermal expansion. So thermal expansion deals with the fact that hard solids like wood or stone or steel, hard solids, not soft solids, hard, expand when they get hotter and get smaller, contract again when they get colder. Now, don't expect that when you put a pan on the stove and you heat it up, you actually will see the pan get bigger. It's very small, percentage, but it does get bigger, and it actually plays an important role in many things that you see or experience around you. For example, you may have been taking the train from, from Tel Aviv to Haifa, I don't know how far north it gets, and usually when the train approaches the station and it slows down, you hear this clickety-clack sound of the wheels. The reason is that the rail is made out of sections, and those sections are placed not against each other, but there's a little gap in between. The gap is there so that the rail can expand when it gets hotter without, buckling the rail. This is a picture of a railroad in India that was laid incorrectly, with the rails against each other, got hot, and it started to buckle. When you build big, tall buildings, like, there's a few in Haifa, and I've seen quite a few in Tel Aviv, you have steel beams and other materials. You need to take into account the contraction and expansion of these steel beams. So in engineering, it's really important. But even in daily life, it's actually quite important. Next time that you go to your dentist, and he or she fills a cavity, I'm not hoping he or she will do, but let's say he or she does. The choice of material is very important. In fact, the mixture of materials, silver and another one, I forgot what it is, that they use called amalgam, is chosen very carefully so as to have the expansion match the expansion of the bone. Different materials have different amounts of expansion. If you put in just, a pure material, you'd have a big problem, because next time you drink a cup of coffee or tea, the metal would expand more than the tooth around it, and it'd crack the tooth in two. So you may think thermal expansion is not important to me. I'm sorry, it is very important to you because you experience it daily. Now, the reason is that atoms don't sit still. They vibrate. And the amplitude of that vibration is proportional to what we call temperature. So these are cold atoms, and these are hot atoms. Cold atoms, hot atoms. So if you were an atom right now sitting there in a regular pattern determined by these chairs, you wouldn't just sit like this, you'd actually be shaking. And as it gets hotter, you'd be shaking more, and you would need more space. As you shake over a bigger amplitude, you push the people around you away. That's essentially what is happening to the atoms. And it's not just those 9 atoms, right? Because real solids consist of many more than 9 atoms. It's all the millions of billions of atoms that make up a solid. So, cold and hot. Questions, anyone? I knew I was a brilliant lecturer, so thank you so much for reaffirming that. But, I'm not going to simply hide this screen and then ask you, when solids get hotter, the atoms expand because A, the atoms get closer together, B, they stay the same distance, C, they get further apart. No, because that would be me transferring information to you, and you transferring that same information back to me. I'm going to see if you can take this picture of atoms getting further apart from each other, all of them, and apply that to a different context. So you better ask me questions. Cold and hot. Cold and hot. If you don't ask questions, I'm going to ask questions. Yes?
Why is the one in the center doesn't move?
Oh, that's a very good question. And you're not going to like my answer. You're not going to like my answer. I'll tell you. Did you notice that? Let me show that to everybody. The one in the center doesn't move. Cold and hot. So I'll tell you why the one in the center is not moving. And I have to warn you, you're not going to like my reply. The one in the center is not moving because I used Adobe Illustrator to make this drawing. And I made two drawings. I made this drawing of the 9 atoms, and then I made this other drawing of the 9 atoms, and then I slammed them on top of each other, cut, paste, and I put the central atom on top of the other central atom. That's why it doesn't move. And you're laughing because it's true. Now notice that that was a choice, right? A choice I made. I could equally well, this is why it's such a good question, I could equally well have decided to take this atom and put it on top of that gray atom. Can you imagine that? What would have happened to this atom then? It would move to the bottom and the right. And this one, instead of moving towards the left, would have moved straight down. And that one, instead of moving up, would have moved towards the right. And this one, of course, would now not have moved because I would have pinned it on top of each other. But the end result would still have been the same. All the atoms further away from each other. And remember, in a real solid, there are not 9 atoms. There are not 9 million atoms. There are not 9 billion atoms. There are not 9 billion atoms. No, there are billions of billions of billions of atoms, and the position of any given atom is actually a completely irrelevant quantity. The key point is they all get further away from each other. Thank you, really good question. Okay, any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to ask my question.
Everything is so symmetric.
So symmetric, yes, and most, at least crystalline solids, tend to be very symmetric. That's not true for all solid material, but a key point in solid is all the atoms, however they are arranged, symmetric or non-symmetrical, such as in glass, for example, which is an amorphous solid. The atoms hold each other in a given pattern with respect to each other. It could be a regular symmetric pattern, or it could be a random pattern. That's a key point. Yes?
I don't know if this is relevant to the issue, but you talk about atoms. What about things we learned about a long time ago, electron, proton?
Very good. So each atom consists of protons, electrons. So an atom has a given structure too. But typically within a material, a fluid, a solid, or a liquid or gas, the atoms themselves don't change. They're sort of like building blocks of a material. So for the purpose of this question, you can forget about the inner structure of each atom. We're only thinking about the atomic structure of materials. You know, we've gone way beyond what I'm going to ask you, so I think it's safe for me to ask you the question. So here are the ground rules. I'm going to ask you the question, but then I'm sorry, it's too late to ask me a question, okay? You got to think. So I want you to think about the question individually. And I know you're not all physicists or engineers, but it doesn't matter. Do your best shot at thinking about the answer to my question. I do not want you to talk to anyone else. If you talk to someone else, I'm going to ask you to stand up and tell the whole room what you just told your neighbor, out of fairness. Okay. Then we're going to vote. Everybody's going to vote. And after that, I'm going to ask you to find a neighbor who has a different answer. So if you turn to your right and that person has the same answer, don't start talking to that person. Say, thank you very much, and you turn to the person on your left. If that person also has the same answer, talk to the person in front or behind. If you can't find anybody with a different answer, get up and walk around. It's perfectly fine. And if you're sitting alone in the back and I see you not talk to anyone, I will come and talk to you, okay? I tell that to my students too. They immediately reseat themselves. They don't want to talk to me. Instructions clear? Okay, good. So here we go. Consider a rectangular metal plate with a circular hole in it. Now imagine we heat this plate uniformly so that it gets hotter everywhere, just in the same way. While this metal gets hotter and expands, what happens to the diameter of the hole? Will the diameter of the hole increase? Will it stay the same? Or will it decrease? So I'm going to give you about a minute. No need to vote yet. Let's wait until people have had some time to think about it. Who would like more time to think? If you want more time to think, wave at me discreetly, okay? Okay, I see a few people who want more time to think, so I'm going to give you another 30 seconds. Okay, since the purpose of this is not for you to teach you physics, but just to demonstrate the method, for those of you, if you've not been able to make up your mind yet, make it a game, okay? Just guess. But you have to commit yourself to an answer. So there we go. At the count of 3. 1, 2, and 3. Everybody. Okay, hold it there for just a second because I need to see. Okay, interestingly enough, answers are clustering, but we have a good distribution here. So find somebody who has a different answer and try to convince that person that you're right and he or she is wrong. Go ahead. Everybody. Everybody. Look at that. You all got fired up. I'm sure that by now many of you, look at that. They're still talking there. Hello? She doesn't even notice that I'm starting to talk again, which is great because that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I'm sure that it's okay. You know, you've already made the point I wanted to make. I'm sure that by now many of you have forgotten that I am not here to talk about metal plates with circular holes. I'm here to talk about education. The answer to this question doesn't even matter. But I'm sure you want to know the answer. So, you know, before I tell you the answer, let's analyze what happened here. I told you a little about thermal expansion, which should have happened before this talk, but it couldn't for, you know, organizational reasons, so that's okay, but in a normal class it would have happened before. Then I asked you a question, and you thought about the question, and I had you make a commitment and an answer. And after you made that commitment, I asked you to externalize that answer, to turn to a neighbor and say, I chose, let's say 2 or 1 or 3. What did you have? And after that, something interesting happened. I could see it, even though all of you were talking in Hebrew, and I don't speak Hebrew, I could see it from the gesticulation. You started to talk not about the answer, but about the reasons for the answer. It was no longer the answer that was important. It was the reasoning that became important. In a sense, this brings back the thinking process. So much of education is focused on the answer, but in any real-world problem, it's not the outcome that matters. The outcome is already predetermined. It's how you get to that desired outcome that is important. This brings the thinking process back into the classroom. But most importantly, you became emotionally invested in the learning process. If I were to tell you now, sorry, I have to get back to Haifa, bye-bye, you'd come running after me. What's the answer to this question? Well, before I can tell you the answer, you need to vote a second time. Remember, we have to go through this cycle twice. Tell me now what you think the right answer is. If you've not changed your mind, you vote the same thing. If you've changed your mind, then you indicate what you now believe to be the right answer. So at the count of 3, 1, 2, and 3. But keep it there for a second so I can see. I thought I was a good lecturer, and so did you, because you didn't ask me many questions. I had to wait a long time before I finally got a question. Yet initially, only 30% or so of you got the right answer. And you know you need more than 30% in order to make this process really work. Which is actually great, because you made a very important point. By the way you voted, you've told me, Eric, your lecturing sucks. Which is actually a point I wanted to make, right? It may sound clear, but you really haven't had a chance to internalize the answer yet. The right answer is, look at that, everybody's looking at me right now. Could I have a drum roll? The right answer is number 1, it increases. And I am happy to report that after the discussion, the percentage went up from, about 30% to somewhere between probably 50 and 60%. So even though we started very low, it worked. Now, I do not want you to lie in bed tonight at 2 a.m. wide awake, thinking, about this question. So let me take another minute of my precious time. Imagine you have a jar of jam or pickles in the refrigerator. It's a glass jar with a metal lid. You take it out of the refrigerator, try to open it, you can't open it. What do? You bang it, that's one way, but another way is you run the metal lid under hot water. The lid expands, and the lid is a ring and a plate. The ring gets bigger. You say, you didn't ask about a metal jar. Okay, good. Let's imagine that you have a plate. We'll use this as a mock-up of the plate. No hole in it. You take a pen, and you draw a circle. So now you have a plate with a circle. You put the plate with the circle in the oven, and you turn up the oven, and the plate expands. What happens to the diameter of the ring that you've drawn, or the circle that you've drawn? It gets bigger, everything gets bigger, so the circle is going to get bigger too. You say, that's unfair, there's no hole. If there was a hole, then the metal would expand into the hole. In fact, the dominant other answer was number 3. I'll show you what's wrong with that reasoning. Let's say that we all go outside in front of this building, and we all hold hands, forming a big ring. Each of us is an atom at the edge of the hole. Can you imagine that? Those dots, each of those is one of us. Now we all stand there, and we all take a step towards the center of the hole. What just happened to the distance between us?
Smaller.
It gets smaller. Can't get smaller because we're shaking more, our neighbor is shaking more. We need more space. The only way to make more space would be to remove a few of us. But atoms don't disappear like that. Remember, they hold each other in the same position. Or to make the hole larger. You won't forget this. Now, back to peer instruction. The first year that I did this, I doubled the learning gains. It was not a 10%, 20%, or even 50% increase. No, 100% increase. And over the years, by asking better questions, I managed to triple it. And a study at Carnegie Mellon showed that students who are taught this way tend to retain the information better because the brain doesn't store memorized facts. The brain stores models, ways of thinking, as you correctly pointed out. And you only get to that by constantly, critically analyzing your own thinking and that of others. So I hope that I've convinced you in this talk that education is more than just transferring information. That's not enough. There are better ways of transferring information than lecturing. And it's not enough to simply get students to do what we do. I want my students to stand on my shoulders. I want my students to solve the problems that I cannot solve. We want the next generation to solve the problems that this generation can't solve. There are lots of problems. Energy, water, conflict, you name it. We need to equip the next generation with the skills to solve those problems. And by just telling them to mimic what we do, it's not going to be enough. We need to give them the thinking skills to accomplish that. And in order to do that, I think it's absolutely critical to have this kind of active engagement and social interaction, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. Thank you very much for your attention.